8-year-old Tommy Martinez and his uncle Jake disappeared from their mountain campsite on a clear Saturday morning. But the most disturbing part wasn't their disappearance. It was what they left behind. Their tent was zipped shut from the inside. Tommy's medication was laid out for the morning, and Uncle Jake's satellite phone showed a text message drafted but never sent. Having the best time with Tommy. He's learning so much. What the maintenance crew found buried near Tommy and Jake's campsite changed this missing persons case into something far more complex. The belongings weren't scattered or damaged like you'd expect from an accident. They were organized, protected, and deliberately concealed. Tommy's dinosaur backpack contained a journal he'd been keeping during the camping trip, but the final entry was written in handwriting that didn't match an 8-year-old's normal script. Uncle Jake says we have to hide our old life now. But to understand how an 8-year-old boy and his uncle could vanish without a trace, leaving behind evidence that suggested they'd planned their own disappearance, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to that weekend in June 2022, when Jake Martinez finally agreed to take his nephew on the camping trip Tommy had been begging for all spring. Why had Jake been so reluctant to take Tommy camping? And what changed his mind? Jake Martinez had always been the favorite uncle in the family. At 32, he was young enough to relate to kids, but old enough to be responsible. He worked as a software engineer in Denver, made good money, and lived alone in a downtown apartment. Tommy's parents, Maria and Carlos Martinez, often asked Jake to babysit because he was the only adult who could keep up with their energetic son. But when Tommy started asking about camping trips, Jake always found excuses. Too busy with work. Wrong time of year. Maybe next summer. His family thought he was just being cautious, but was there another reason Jake avoided taking Tommy into the wilderness? The breakthrough came in May 2022 when Tommy's school organized a camping trip that he couldn't attend due to a family wedding. The 8-year-old was devastated, crying for hours about missing out on his first real outdoor adventure. That's when Jake finally called Maria and offered to take Tommy camping himself. "I can't stand to see him so disappointed," Jake told his sister. "One weekend in the mountains won't hurt anything." Won't hurt what? What was Jake worried about? The camping trip was planned for the second weekend in June. Jake researched family-friendly campgrounds, bought new gear, and even purchased a first aid course to make sure he could handle any emergency. He seemed genuinely excited about bonding with his nephew, but friends later said he was also unusually nervous. Sarah Chen, Tommy's second-grade teacher, remembered Jake picking up camping permission forms from school. He asked very specific questions about emergency procedures, she recalled. What happens if a child gets lost? How long do search teams typically look? It seemed odd for someone planning a simple camping trip. Why was Uncle Jake asking about search procedures before the trip even began? The Martinez family dropped Tommy off at Jake's apartment on Friday evening, June 10th, 2022. The 8-year-old was practically bouncing with excitement, his dinosaur backpack stuffed with clothes, toys, and a journal his mother had bought him to document his first camping adventure. Maria later told investigators she felt completely confident leaving Tommy with Jake. "He's the most responsible person I know," she said. "If anyone could keep Tommy safe in the wilderness, it was Jake." But was keeping Tommy safe the only thing on Jake's mind? The drive to Pine Ridge Campground took 3 hours through winding mountain roads. Jake had chosen a popular destination with other families, plenty of park rangers and cell phone coverage. Everything about the location suggested he wanted maximum safety and visibility. So why did they disappear from one of the most supervised camping areas in Colorado? Other campers at Pine Ridge remembered seeing Tommy and Jake arrive around 8 p.m. on Friday. They set up their tent efficiently, organized their gear with military precision, and joined the evening campfire activities. Tommy was shy at first, but quickly made friends with other kids, while Jake chatted easily with the parents about hiking trails and weather conditions. Everything seemed perfectly normal for a uncle-nephew camping trip. But was normal what Jake was really aiming for? Or was he establishing alibis and witness accounts? The first sign that something might be wrong came on Saturday morning when Tommy didn't appear for the organized nature walk at 9 a.m. Other kids had been looking forward to hiking with the enthusiastic 8-year-old, but his tent remained zipped shut while families gathered for the activity. Park Ranger Steve Williams knocked on the tent around 9:30 a.m. to check if Tommy was feeling well. No one answered. When Williams unzipped the tent flap, he discovered something that made no sense. The tent was empty, but it had been zipped shut from the inside. How did two people exit a tent and then zip it closed from the inside? The immediate search revealed more puzzling details. Tommy's medication for his mild asthma was laid out on the camping table, suggesting they'd planned to stay for breakfast. Jake's coffee cup sat beside the camp stove, still half full and lukewarm. Most strange of all, Jake's expensive satellite phone was charging on the picnic table, displaying a drafted text message that had never been sent. The message was addressed to Maria and Carlos. Having the best time with Tommy. He's learning so much. We'll call tonight with updates. Why draft a message but never send it? And what exactly was Tommy supposed to be learning? The initial search involved over 50 volunteers, including park rangers, local law enforcement, and other camping families. They combed the immediate area for any sign of where Tommy and Jake might have gone. Search dogs tracked scents that led in multiple directions before fading at the edge of the campground. The strangest discovery came when investigators found 2 sets of footprints leading away from the tent toward the forest. The tracks were clear and deliberate, not like people fleeing in panic or being forced to move. They walked side by side for about 100 yards before the trail simply vanished on a rocky outcrop. It was as if Tommy and Jake had planned exactly where their footprints should disappear. Detective Sarah Chen was assigned to the case on day 3 of the search. A 15-year veteran of missing persons investigations, she immediately noticed details that troubled her. This wasn't a typical lost camper scenario. The evidence suggested planning, preparation, and possibly deception. But why would a loving uncle plan to disappear with his 8-year-old nephew? What could motivate such an elaborate vanishing act? The answers wouldn't come for 2 years, when a routine trail maintenance project uncovered evidence that would transform the case from a tragic disappearance into something far more sinister. Because what they found buried in the mountain soil would prove that Tommy Martinez and Uncle Jake hadn't been victims at all. They had been partners in one of the most carefully planned disappearances in Colorado history. The discovery that Tommy and Jake might have been partners in their own disappearance sent shockwaves through Detective Chen's investigation, but she needed hard evidence before she could accept such an impossible theory. How could an 8-year-old child plan his own vanishing act? The answer began to emerge when forensic experts analyzed the buried belongings found by the trail maintenance crew. What they discovered challenged every assumption about the uncle-nephew relationship and the true nature of their camping trip. The burial site itself revealed careful planning. The belongings had been wrapped in multiple layers of waterproof plastic, sealed with industrial tape, and buried exactly 3 feet underground. Someone had taken great care to preserve these items. But why? More disturbing was what the belongings contained. Tommy's dinosaur backpack held clothes that were too small for him, as if he'd already outgrown them by the time they were buried. Jake's wallet contained his driver's license, credit cards, and social security card, documents no one abandons unless they never plan to use their legal identity again. But it was Tommy's camping journal that provided the most shocking revelations. The journal started normally, with entries written in typical 8-year-old handwriting. Day 1. Uncle Jake let me pick our campsite. I chose the one near the big rock because it looks like a dinosaur. The early entries described fishing attempts, failed s'more making, and excitement about sleeping in a tent. Then, on the 3rd day, the handwriting changed. The final entry was written in neat, adult-like script that didn't match Tommy's previous writing. Uncle Jake says we have to hide our old life now. He says the bad people will stop looking for us if they think we're gone forever. I understand why we can't go home. What 8-year-old writes with such mature handwriting? And what bad people were Tommy and Jake hiding from? Detective Chen brought in handwriting experts to analyze the journal. The results were disturbing. The final entry had been guided by an adult hand. Someone had helped Tommy write those words, coaching him through each letter to create the appearance of a child's willing participation. But was Tommy truly willing, or was he being manipulated by someone he trusted? The investigation took a darker turn when Chen discovered Jake's internet search history from the weeks before the camping trip. His computer revealed hours of research into topics that had nothing to do with outdoor recreation. How to disappear without a trace, living off the grid with children, fake death techniques that fool investigators. Jake Martinez hadn't been planning a simple camping trip. He'd been researching how to vanish permanently with his nephew. But why? What would motivate a successful software engineer to abandon his life and take his 8-year-old nephew with him? The answer came from an unexpected source. Tommy's school counselor, Mrs. Patricia Davies. During a routine follow-up interview, she revealed information that had been buried in confidential files for months. Tommy had been displaying behavioral changes since the previous fall. He'd become withdrawn in class, stopped participating in group activities, and started asking disturbing questions about whether children could live away from their parents if home wasn't safe anymore. When Mrs. Davies had asked Tommy about these concerns, the 8-year-old had mentioned that Uncle Jake was teaching him important secrets about staying safe. But safe from what? The school had documented several incidents where Tommy arrived with unexplained injuries. Bruises on his arms, a black eye he claimed came from falling off his bike, scratches he said were from playing in the yard. The injuries weren't severe enough to warrant a child services investigation, but they formed a concerning pattern. Had someone been hurting Tommy? And was Jake trying to protect his nephew by making them both disappear? Detective Chen obtained court orders to examine Tommy's medical records. What she found painted a disturbing picture of a child living in fear. Emergency room visits for accidents that seemed inconsistent with the reported causes. A pediatrician's notes expressing concern about Tommy's tendency to flinch when adults moved suddenly. But the most revealing document was a letter Tommy's teacher had written to the principal, expressing worry about the child's home situation. The letter had been filed but never acted upon, a bureaucratic oversight that might have cost Tommy his safety. The letter described Tommy asking his teacher whether uncles can become daddies if real daddies aren't good anymore. The 8-year-old had also drawn pictures during art class that showed a small figure hiding while larger figures argued in the background. Was Jake Martinez trying to save his nephew from an abusive situation at home? This theory gained support when Chen discovered that Jake had been quietly documenting Tommy's injuries for months. Hidden in Jake's computer files were photographs of bruises, timestamps of concerning behavior, and detailed notes about conversations where Tommy had hinted at problems at home. Jake hadn't been planning a kidnapping. He'd been building a case for rescue. But if Jake was trying to protect Tommy, why hadn't he contacted authorities? Why choose disappearance over legal intervention? The answer came from Jake's own research files. He'd spent weeks studying child custody laws, abuse reporting procedures, and the success rates of Child Protective Services interventions. His notes revealed growing frustration with a system he believed would fail Tommy. Legal channels take months, Jake had written in one document. Tommy doesn't have months. Every day he stays in that house, the damage gets worse. Sometimes protecting someone you love means breaking rules that don't work. Jake Martinez had concluded that the only way to save his nephew was to make them both disappear permanently. But had his plan worked, or had they simply traded one dangerous situation for another? The buried belongings suggested that Jake's plan had been more complex than simple disappearance. Among the items was a hand-drawn map in Tommy's childish handwriting, showing a route through the mountains to something labeled "Our New Safe House." The map indicated a specific location about 15 miles deeper into the wilderness, accessible only by hiking trails that would be difficult for search teams to navigate. Jake had apparently prepared a hidden shelter where he and Tommy could wait until the search was called off. But if their plan was working, why had they buried their belongings? And where were they now, 2 years after their disappearance? Detective Chen assembled a search team to investigate the location marked on Tommy's map. What they found there would either confirm Jake's rescue mission or reveal something far more sinister about the uncle-nephew relationship that no one had seen coming. The truth was waiting in the mountains, and it would finally explain why an 8-year-old boy had written, "We have to hide our old life now," in handwriting that wasn't entirely his own. The search team's journey to Tommy's mapped location would take them 15 miles into unmarked wilderness, but Detective Chen knew they were finally following a real lead. After 2 years of dead ends, an 8-year-old's hand-drawn map might finally reveal what happened to Tommy Martinez and his Uncle Jake. But what they found at the coordinates would challenge everything Chen thought she knew about protective uncles and the lengths people will go to save the children they love. The hike through Pine Ridge's backcountry was treacherous. Steep mountain trails, dense forest coverage, and terrain that hadn't been disturbed by human activity in years. This wasn't a place you'd choose for casual camping. It was a place you'd go to hide. Why had Jake picked such an isolated location for their safe house? The search team consisted of Detective Chen, 2 park rangers, a tracking specialist, and a child psychologist, Dr. Amanda Torres, who specialized in cases involving missing children. If they found Tommy alive, Dr. Torres would be essential for assessing his mental state after 2 years of hiding. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, Chen couldn't shake the feeling that they might not find what they were expecting. The first sign they were on the right track came 3 hours into the hike. Ranger Martinez spotted something that didn't belong in the natural landscape. A small piece of blue plastic wrapped around a tree branch, positioned about eye level for an 8-year-old child. It was a trail marker, deliberately placed to guide someone through the forest. But guide them where? Following Tommy's markers led the search team deeper into territory that park rangers rarely patrolled. The trail became increasingly difficult to navigate, requiring climbing equipment and mountain rescue techniques. This wasn't a path a normal 8-year-old could manage alone. How had Tommy been expected to reach this location without adult help? The answer came when they found Jake's modifications to the natural terrain. Hand-cut steps in rocky outcrops, rope anchors drilled into cliff faces, even a primitive pulley system to help lift supplies up steep inclines. Jake had spent weeks, possibly months, preparing this route for a child to follow. But when had he done all this work? Jake had a full-time job in Denver and no history of extended camping trips. Detective Chen checked Jake's employment records and credit card statements from the months before the disappearance. The evidence revealed a pattern of suspicious activity. Jake had been taking frequent sick days and weekend trips, always alone, always to outdoor equipment stores in different counties. He'd been building this mountain refuge for over 6 months, using fake names and cash purchases to avoid creating a paper trail. This wasn't a spontaneous rescue mission. It was a long-term project with detailed planning. But why go to such elaborate lengths? If Jake truly believed Tommy was being abused at home, wouldn't a simple camping trip away from the family have been sufficient to keep him safe temporarily? The answer waited at the coordinates marked on Tommy's map, 4 hours into their mountain climb. What the search team found there wasn't just a hidden campsite. It was a fully functional wilderness home designed for permanent habitation. Jake had constructed a sophisticated shelter using natural materials and camouflage techniques that made it nearly invisible from above. Solar panels provided electricity. A water filtration system connected to a nearby stream. Food storage areas that could support 2 people for months. This wasn't a temporary hiding place. Jake had built a permanent new home for himself and Tommy. But the most disturbing discovery was what the shelter contained. Evidence that someone had been living there recently. Fresh food supplies, clothing in Tommy's current size, and school books suggesting that Jake had been continuing the 8-year-old's education in isolation. Were Tommy and Jake still alive and living in this mountain hideaway? Dr. Torres examined the living space for psychological indicators. What she found troubled her deeply. The shelter was divided into separate areas with strict boundaries, sleeping spaces that couldn't be crossed, work areas with specific rules, and a quiet zone where talking was forbidden. This wasn't the home of a loving uncle and nephew. It was the home of someone maintaining rigid control over a child's behavior. The truth became clearer when they discovered Jake's journal, hidden under loose floorboards in the main shelter area. The entries revealed a man whose protective instincts had evolved into something far more controlling and dangerous. Day 127. Tommy tried to leave the boundary markers again today. Had to explain once more why he can never go back to the outside world. He's starting to understand that I'm the only person who truly cares about keeping him safe. Day 127. Jake's journal suggested they'd been living in the wilderness for over 4 months. But where were they now? Day 203. Tommy asked about his parents again. I showed him the fake newspaper article I created about the car accident. He cried for hours. But now he understands why we can never return to his old life. Sometimes protecting someone requires creating new truths. Fake newspaper article? Car accident? Detective Chen felt her blood run cold as she realized what Jake had done. He hadn't just hidden Tommy from an abusive home situation. He'd convinced the 8-year-old that his parents were dead, that the outside world was dangerous, and that Jake was his only protector and family. Tommy Martinez wasn't a willing partner in his own disappearance. He was a victim of psychological manipulation by the uncle he'd trusted most. But if Jake had been keeping Tommy isolated for months, documenting his daily control over the child, where were they now? The shelter showed signs of recent abandonment, as if its occupants had left suddenly and never returned. The answer came from Jake's final journal entries, dated just 2 weeks earlier. Day 681. Tommy is getting older, asking harder questions about the world outside our safe zone. Yesterday, he found the trail we used to get here and started walking toward the old campground before I stopped him. He's becoming harder to control. Day 687. I can see doubt in Tommy's eyes when I explain why we have to stay hidden. He's starting to remember things I told him to forget. The programming isn't holding as well as it used to. Programming? Jake was referring to his nephew like a computer system that needed constant updates to function properly. Day 693. Tommy ran away this morning. I found him 6 hours later at the edge of the forest, trying to flag down cars on the highway. He kept saying he wanted to go home to Mama. I had to make him understand that home doesn't exist anymore. The final entry was the most chilling. Day 695. Tomorrow I'm taking Tommy to the permanent safe place. Somewhere he'll never be confused about the outside world again. Somewhere he'll understand that I'm the only family he needs. The cave system I discovered last month will be perfect. No daylight to remind him of the world we left behind. Detective Chen's hands trembled as she read Jake's plan. He wasn't protecting Tommy anymore. He was planning to imprison him in underground caves where the 8-year-old would lose all connection to reality. The search team had found Jake's mountain home, but they were 2 weeks too late. Jake Martinez had taken Tommy Martinez somewhere even more isolated, somewhere the boy might never be found. But where was this permanent safe place? And did Tommy Martinez, now 10 years old after 2 years of psychological captivity, even remember that he had a family still searching for him? The race to find them had become a race against time, and a child's fading memory of the world he'd been stolen from. Jake's final journal entry about taking Tommy to the permanent safe place sent Detective Chen's team into urgent action. They had 2 weeks to make up, and a 10-year-old boy who might not even remember his real name anymore. But finding a cave system in thousands of square miles of wilderness would be like searching for a needle in a haystack, especially when Jake had spent months preparing hiding places that even experienced rangers couldn't locate. The search for the caves began with Jake's earlier journal entries, looking for any mention of underground locations he'd discovered during his months of preparation. Most of his writing focused on the mountain shelter, but scattered throughout were references to backup locations and deeper safe zones. Why did Jake need multiple hiding places? Was he planning for different scenarios, or had his paranoia grown worse over time? Dr. Torres, the child psychologist, studied Jake's psychological progression through his journal entries. What she found was deeply disturbing. A man whose protective instincts had gradually transformed into obsessive control and paranoid delusion. Jake started with genuine concern for Tommy's safety, Dr. Torres explained to the search team. But isolation and the stress of maintaining his elaborate deception created a feedback loop. The more he isolated Tommy from reality, the more he convinced himself that the outside world was truly dangerous. Had Jake's rescue mission become a prison of his own making? The breakthrough came when park geologists provided maps of known cave systems in the region. There were dozens of possibilities, but most were either too dangerous for a child or too well known to provide the isolation Jake was seeking. One location stood out: The Serpent's Hollow Cave Network, discovered by spelunkers in the 1970s, but sealed off after several accidents. The caves were deep, complex, and officially off-limits to the public. But the sealing had been done with simple barriers that someone with Jake's technical skills could bypass. Was this Jake's permanent safe place? The Serpent's Hollow entrance was located 8 miles from Jake's mountain shelter, accessible only by an unmarked trail that required rappelling equipment to navigate safely. For a 10-year-old child, the journey would have been terrifying and potentially deadly. But Jake's journal had mentioned teaching Tommy advanced survival skills. Had he been preparing the boy for this final dangerous relocation? The search team reached the cave entrance after a grueling 6-hour hike. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The official barriers had been removed, replaced by Jake's own security measures designed to keep people out while allowing him and Tommy to come and go. But the most chilling discovery was fresh evidence of recent activity. Food wrappers, water bottles, and child-sized clothing scattered around the cave entrance. Someone had been living here within the past few days. Were Jake and Tommy still in the cave system? Or had they moved even deeper underground? Detective Chen made the difficult decision to enter the caves immediately, despite the dangerous conditions and limited visibility. Every hour that passed meant Tommy was spending more time in an environment that could permanently damage his psychological development. The cave system was a nightmare of narrow passages, underground streams, and chambers that disappeared into total darkness. Jake had marked a route with glow sticks, but many had died out, leaving only faint chemical traces to follow. How had Jake convinced a 10-year-old to live in this underground maze? The answer came when they found Jake's underground camp in the deepest accessible chamber, nearly half a mile from the surface. He had created a living space using battery-powered lights, camping equipment, and supplies that must have taken weeks to transport and position. But the most disturbing element was how he decorated Tommy's sleeping area, with photographs of the mountain shelter, drawings of forest animals, and artificial plants designed to simulate the outdoor world. Tommy was no longer allowed to see. Jake had created a fake nature preserve underground, trying to give Tommy the illusion of outdoor life while keeping him completely isolated from reality. But where were they now? The camp showed signs of recent abandonment, with food still fresh and equipment arranged as if the occupants had stepped away temporarily. Detective Chen found her answer in Jake's final message, carved into the cave wall with a knife. "If anyone finds this, know that I saved Tommy from a world that would have destroyed him. We've gone to the deepest safe place where no one will ever hurt him again." The deepest safe place? How much further underground had Jake taken a 10-year-old child? Dr. Torres examined the psychological implications of Jake's message. "He's completely lost touch with reality," she told Chen. "In his mind, he's not imprisoning Tommy. He's protecting him from imaginary threats. But that makes him even more dangerous, because he'll fight anyone who tries to rescue Tommy from his protection." The search team pressed deeper into the cave system, following faint traces of human passage into areas that hadn't been mapped by the original spelunking expeditions. The passages became narrower, the air thinner, and the psychological pressure of being so far underground began affecting even the experienced rescue team. How could a child survive in these conditions? And what was this environment doing to Tommy's developing mind? The answer came when they heard something that made everyone freeze. The sound of a child singing, echoing faintly through the cave passages. It was a voice that had been missing for 2 years. Now reaching them from somewhere deep in the mountain's heart. Tommy Martinez was a lie. But after 2 years of psychological manipulation and weeks of underground isolation, would he even recognize the people who had come to save him? Detective Chen called out, "Tommy, can you hear me? We're here to take you home!" The singing stopped. Then, after a long moment of silence, a small voice echoed back through the darkness. "Uncle Jake says home doesn't exist anymore. Uncle Jake says you're the bad people who want to hurt me." Jake's programming had worked. Tommy Martinez no longer trusted the outside world, and he might fight against his own rescue. The team was close to finding them, but their biggest challenge wasn't navigating the caves. It was convincing a traumatized 10-year-old that the uncle he'd trusted was the one who had been hurting him all along, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, Jake Martinez was preparing for a confrontation that he believed would determine whether Tommy lived or died. The confrontation with Jake Martinez happened in the deepest chamber of the cave system, where 2 years of psychological manipulation would finally face the light of truth. But convincing a traumatized 10-year-old that his protector was actually his captor would require more than just rescue. It would require breaking through layers of programmed fear. Detective Chen found them in a chamber barely large enough for 2 people, illuminated by battery-powered lights that cast eerie shadows on the rock walls. Jake sat protectively in front of Tommy, who was pressed against the cave wall, clearly terrified by the arrival of strangers. "You can't have him," Jake said immediately. "Tommy's safe here. The outside world is too dangerous." But was Tommy really safe, or was Jake's protection the most dangerous threat of all? Dr. Torres took the lead, using techniques designed for hostage situations involving children. "Tommy," she said gently, "my name is Dr. Torres. I know your mama, Maria. She's been looking for you every single day for 2 years. Tommy shook his head violently. "Mama died in the car accident. Uncle Jake showed me the newspaper. The fake newspaper article Jake had created to maintain his control. But Dr. Torres had prepared for this moment, carrying something that would cut through Jake's lies. Tommy's own school photo from before the disappearance, along with recent pictures of Maria and Carlos Martinez holding missing posters with Tommy's face. Tommy, look at these pictures. Your parents are alive and they miss you so much." For the first time in 2 years, doubt flickered in Tommy's eyes. Jake became agitated, recognizing that his carefully constructed reality was crumbling. "Don't listen to them, Tommy. They're here to take you back to the people who hurt you." But Dr. Torres had studied Jake's journal entries. She knew the truth about Tommy's home situation, and it wasn't what Jake had convinced himself. "Jake, we investigated Tommy's family. There was no abuse. Tommy's bruises came from normal childhood activities. His parents never hurt him. They loved him desperately." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. The foundation of his entire rescue mission crumbled in an instant. "No," Jake whispered. "I saved him. I protected him. The injuries, the fear in his eyes, were normal childhood experiences that you misinterpreted," Dr. Torres said firmly. "Your protective instincts made you see danger that didn't exist." Tommy, listening to this exchange, began to remember fragments of his real life. Birthday parties, bedtime stories, his mother's warm hugs, memories that Jake's programming had tried to erase. "I remember Mama's cookies," Tommy said quietly. "She made them every Sunday." The simple memory broke through 2 years of psychological conditioning. Tommy started to cry, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that he'd been stolen from a family who loved him. Jake's mental breakdown was complete. Faced with the truth that his rescue mission had been an elaborate kidnapping based on his own paranoid delusions, he collapsed emotionally. The man who had convinced himself he was Tommy's savior finally understood that he had been his tormentor. The extraction from the caves took hours, with Dr. Torres carefully guiding Tommy through each step while reassuring him that he was finally going home to his real family. Jake offered no resistance, overwhelmed by guilt and the collapse of his distorted worldview. 6 months later, Tommy Martinez was living with his parents again, undergoing intensive therapy to process 2 years of psychological trauma. The adjustment wasn't easy. He still sometimes woke up afraid that the outside world was dangerous, still occasionally asked if Uncle Jake's stories about car accidents were true. But every day, Tommy remembered a little more about the loving family he'd been stolen from. He returned to school, made new friends, and slowly began to trust that the world outside Uncle Jake's caves was actually safe. Jake Martinez was sentenced to 15 years for kidnapping and child endangerment. During his trial, psychological evaluations revealed a man who had genuinely believed he was protecting his nephew, even as he destroyed the child's life. Detective Chen kept one item from the case: Tommy's original dinosaur backpack, found buried in the mountain soil where this nightmare began. It served as a reminder that sometimes the people we trust most can cause the greatest harm, and that protecting children sometimes means protecting them from those who claim to love them most. Tommy Martinez had been found, but his story raised difficult questions about the fine line between protection and control, love and obsession, salvation and imprisonment. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who convince themselves and their victims that they are the heroes of the story.